You guys heard of the movie Runaway Bride? Yeah? Okay. Runaway Bride was about a phenomenon called cold feet, right? Where this gal had gone to the altar multiple times, and always she would get cold feet, and she would run from the altar, and thus she got the nickname Runaway Bride, and she would leave the prospective groom at the altar. And basically she had this anxiety, this great anxiety about a responsibility or about the endeavor. Now, I never had a runaway groom experience, okay? You guys heard about Pat and me last night. I went up to that altar and I said I do with no trepidation. But for about a half a second, as I was standing there alone, waiting for Pat to come out with her dad, for half a second only, okay? I thought, am I up for this? Am I man enough to do this? Because, you know, for a moment you think about all of that responsibility, right? And so it just came fleeting by, and it just totally caught me by surprise. And I think God was just kind of using it to tell me, listen, you know, buckle up, get yourself ready. Some of you know that one of the things I did when I was approaching my wedding day was I gave away all my vintage, mint condition, first edition Marvel comic books. Because of that verse in the Bible that says, when I became a man, I put away childish things. And I thought that was a symbol of my childhood, and I got to put away childish things. At least for me. Now I wish I didn't do it. I could be rich and retired. But anyway, so I went through that experience. And, you know, on the other hand, you could argue I should have had more of that experience, right? Because it could be a very positive thing to get you ready and to be sober and to think through the vastness and the range of things that it meant for my life for the future. Well, this kind of feeling isn't just for runaway brides and runaway grooms. This happens in a lot of different contexts. Some of you have bought homes, okay? When I bought my first home, I learned of this phrase called buyer's remorse. You heard of that one? Yeah, that's when you plunk down the money, sign on the line, and then suddenly you says, what did I do? You know, can I make these payments? Did I buy off more than I can chew? You know, and you go through that feeling. And so you get that cold feeling. Give you some other examples. Some of you along the line will be asked to make a wedding toast. Whoa. Okay, that could be really hard. That's why a lot of people, before they give the toast, they drink up and, you know, then they can face it. It doesn't make for a good toast, but it does take the edge off of it. But, you know, giving a speech, taking a big test. I remember as a little kid, I would walk up to the high dive board. And each time I was determined, this time, instead of jumping in, I'm going to dive in head first. And you know, when you get up there, you got your little 4 feet looking down all the way to the water and seeing all the way to the bottom of the pool. Well, that magnified it quite a bit. And so every time I did a cannonball, I'd just go straight down. Anyway, leaving home. Just about any time we're asked to sign on the dotted line. And, you know, psychologists have studied this, and they say it's a very interesting phenomenon. The farther away you are from the actual event, the more calm and serene you feel. You feel like, I can do it. I can succeed. This is nothing. And as you approach the event and you get closer, you know, and it can't get so bad that you're going to back out. So this is a very common thing. You know, I have found that this happens in Christianity in our relationship with God. We can sometimes have cold feet, okay? We can get to the place where we fear commitment. You come to a crossroad, and God says, I want you to do this. And we're afraid that we can't follow through. We're afraid that we won't measure up, that we'll be a disappointment. And who wants to be a disappointment to God, right? Jesus gave his all on the cross for us, and we think, I'm going to make this promise, and I'm going to fail. And then you feel like, oh, that's too much. That would hurt too much. And so we'll back away from it. And we will not even contemplate it sometimes. Or after we do, then we may have our regrets, and we will try to step back from that. And so this happens in all of our lives, and it happens in our spiritual life. And the problem when that happens is God has a wonderful plan for our lives. And it's a real adventure. And the more of God and his plan and his will that you get involved in, that I get involved in, the more adventure, the more of his greatness that we're going to discover, and then the more we become impacted, and the more that we are blessed. And so we don't want to back away. We want to be able to move forward and take a hold of these things and say yes to God instead of saying no or wait or maybe. And so anyway, what's going to happen is today we're coming to Nehemiah chapter 9. And it's a very interesting chapter. It is the longest prayer in the Bible. Okay? But good news, this is not like the usual kind of prayer, okay? You ever been in a church where they do a pastoral prayer and it goes a bit long? And then he says, amen, and you suddenly wake up? Yeah, it doesn't happen with this one, okay? It's really very interesting, and what it does is it prepares the people. Because in chapter 10, they're going to sign on the dotted line. They're going to make a new covenant with God. And so Ezra and Nehemiah have wisely thought about how they're going to prepare the people to take this step and to do the right thing. And what they're going to find out as they pray this prayer is that God is faithful even when we're not faithful. And that's the title, Faithful to the Unfaithful. And let's face it right now, all right? Who's going to be unfaithful to God somewhere in the future? Right? I mean, we're going to mess up. And it's okay. We own up to it now. But we don't look at ourselves. We look at God and we look at his faithfulness. And that's what counts. Okay? So this is, again, the work of grace. He takes the burden off of us and he brings us along like the children that we are. And he leads us forward to success. So anyway, what's going to happen is you're going to see the history of Israel, but retold from a spiritual point of view. And God does that a lot, okay? You have the Kings, 2 books called 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Then you've got the Chronicles, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. And when you read it, you say, why is God repeating himself? Given the expense of parchment and how many man-hours it took those monks working with candles to copy all this stuff, why didn't God just kind of put it all together in one? Well, what happens is in Kings, you get a history. But in Chronicles, you get a spiritual interpretation of that history. Okay? And so he does that a lot. And so this prayer, as they go through it and present the history of Israel, you're going to get a spiritual look at this. And so as we're going to go through it, and we're going to go practically through all of chapter 9, except for the setup verses in verses 1 to 4. We're going to see the history, and I want you to see if you can discern any themes, okay? So we're going to go through it, and I'll only make comments to clarify each part. So let's go ahead. Before we do, you don't see him right now, but a moment ago, Perry popped his head up in the window above us, okay? We're so appreciative. Perry is up there manning the camera. He's helping us with some new technology that hopefully will make our ministry up here better and make your experience of learning much better, okay? If he pops up, I might wave to him, and you can all turn around and wave to him. Hey, Perry! Okay? You're away but not forgotten, okay? Anyway, okay, so here we go. And so the people are all ready, okay? They have just finished their feasting. They have just gone through their time of camping out in the backyard by doing the festival of the booths. And now they come in full mourning clothing, and they're ready. And let's jump to verse 6. Okay? And this is what it says. You are the Lord, and you alone. Okay? Nobody else. You made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is in it. And when you see the heaven of heavens, all their hosts, and then you see the earth, it's a way in Old Testament speaking of saying everything. Okay? Way at the top and way at the bottom. So everything, all that is on the earth, the seas and all that is in them, you preserve all of them. Okay? This is underscoring of what God does. He doesn't just make it and go away, but he sticks around and he continues to take care of things. And the hosts of heaven worships you. Okay? Now, next verse, and we're going to be going successfully through all of these verses. We get personal. You see the word Lord there. That is the English way of writing the word Yahweh or Jehovah. Okay? And this is the personal name that God gave to his people, saying, okay, when you want to talk to me and you want to emphasize our relationship, you speak to me as Jehovah or Yahweh. And one is English transliteration. The other one is the more probable Hebrew pronunciation. So you are the Lord or Jehovah, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. So this marks a time when Abram makes a commitment, and he's no longer just this Chaldean, but now he's going to belong to God. So God gives him a new name change befitting his new status. Okay, let's go on to the next verse. You found his heart faithful. That's why you chose him before you, and you made him with him the covenant. All right? A promise. Covenant is something we don't talk about too much nowadays, but in the Old Testament, the covenants were a very special thing. They are a statement not of contract. If you do this, I'm obligated to do this. If I do this, you're obligated to do that. A covenant is, I'm going to do it for you, but you're going to show your appreciation through certain actions. So I'm going to take the initiative. I'm going to make the promise. And we like to emphasize for Christian marriage that they are covenants, that we come forward with unconditionality, and then the other person will respond to our love. So he makes a covenant to give to his offspring the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the, verse 9, we're left hanging, Amorite, the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Girgashites, and you have kept your promise. Why? Because you are righteous. All right? So this is a God who keeps promises, and now we are getting the beginning of the Jewish nation. And we're going to pass from the stage of the patriarchs to the new stage of the people of God as a nation. Now, there's going to be two entirely different levels of presentation of God's power. For the patriarchs, what was the main miracle that they would experience in their lives of God's power? Time and again, the wives were barren or had trouble conceiving. And God would have to come and break through. Well, he's not going to have this situation for the whole nation. And so God's going to be showing his power in other ways. Let's go to verse 9. And this is the deliverance of God. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea. Next. And performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all of his servants. You see, these are the big miracles. And all the people of his land, for you knew that the Egyptians acted arrogantly, next verse, against our fathers, and you made a name for yourself as it is to this day. So it's always about God, all right? Verse 11. So this is what he did. You divided the sea before them so that they went through the midst of the sea onto dry land. You cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into mighty waters. So God is acknowledged as a protector, deliverer, defender. And so by this time, hopefully all the people who were dressed up in sackcloth and ashes. You guys know what sackcloth is? Back in the old days, you buy potatoes or onions and stuff like that, and you get burlap bags, right? And that's kind of a form of sackcloth, okay? So anyway, this is what God is doing for them. And then the story continues, verse 12, and we're going to go to 15. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night to light for them the way in which they should go. All right, so Moses knows the backside of the desert, but God's going to make sure, all right, and he's going to have something high that everybody can see, everybody can follow personally. Verse 13, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven and gave them right rules and true laws and good statutes and commandments. Verse 14, and you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them commandments and statutes and a law by Moses your servant. Next. And you gave them bread from heaven for the hunger and brought water for them out of the rock for their thirst. And you told them to go in to possess the land that you had sworn to give to them. Okay? And so you get this pause, and now suddenly you're going to get the next thing that happened. 16. The very first word. But. So it's going to go in the other direction suddenly. But they and our fathers acted presumptuously and stiffened their neck, and they did not obey your commandments. 17. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you have performed among them. Amazing, huh? How we can forget. But instead they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are God, ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. And I want you to see that word, 2 lines from the bottom, the word merciful. Because the word merciful happens several times in this chapter. And that's what's going to be emphasized, the mercy of God. Okay? And at the bottom, you see, but you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. Now, given the time, I'm going to fast forward near to the end. But basically, what you get through all of this is a cycle. Because when they get into the promised land and they're living under the judges, and later on, as they're living under the kings, this is what happens. God would do something great for them, a deliverance, a miracle or something. And they would make all these promises to God. Yeah, God, we'll do anything you say. then a little while, they're moving along in life, and everything's hunky-dory. Okay? Hunky-dory. You know that word, right? That's Toy Chinese. All right. Anyway, and they would stumble. They would mess up. They would get in trouble. And what will happen is God will let the consequences play out, and usually they end up under subjugation. Philistines, Syrians, whoever. And so they would be in trouble. They would be in slavery. And then after a while of suffering, what would they do? Cry out to God, right? So they would cry out to God, and eventually God will come, and what does he do? He bails them out. And so this happens over and over and over. And what they learn through this whole process of this recitation of their national history is the Jews are basically unfaithful, but God is faithful. Okay? And so that's a very important thing for us to know. Because sometimes, we start to think because we want to do good with God, because we want to please people, that we put the responsibility on ourselves instead of on God. And so we either back away from it, we don't make our commitments, we do a number of different things, and we just don't move forward. But that last part of verse 17 comes from the time, and this portion of Scripture that it comes from in Exodus happens twice in this chapter to remind the people that we have a God who is ready to forgive, who is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. Okay? And so they are to be encouraged to not be afraid of their past failures, but instead to trust not in themselves, but to trust in the God who is greater than them and who is faithful. No need for cold feet, no need for buyer's remorse. That with the commitment that we make, there's hope and we can move forward. So they go through this, they hear it, and they're encouraged. And so in chapter 10, right off, you're going to see the big commitment ceremony. They enter into the covenant with God, which is what they need to do. So going back again to us, do we fear moving forward with God into greater commitment? And the answer of chapter 9 is, don't be afraid. No need to be afraid. My first pastor, when I first approached him and I says, I want to be baptized. And he said to my mother, he wouldn't tell me directly, he's not ready. And my mother told me, and I said, I'm not ready? And I was so disappointed. Okay? Well, as I continued with this pastor, I came to realize that nobody was ready. Okay? People who had been co-founders of the church with him and were serving as church teachers and officers were not ready. Basically, this pastor was afraid. He knew of the human tendency to fall and to fail. And he didn't want God's name to be shamed. And so he says, you're not ready. And so the result was he wouldn't baptize anybody. Okay? And, to take that kind of attitude and to learn from that example is really bad, because we would be misunderstanding God. See, our God is not the kind of God who is watching and waiting for us to fail, thank you, so that we can so that he can gloat over our failures. But let's face it, some of us grow up with parents or older siblings who were just waiting for us to mess up so that they could put us down and to make us feel bad. Okay? And we transfer that sense to God. He's not a God who is watching and waiting to gloat. He's not a God who will automatically ground us when we mess up. He's not the God whom we have to walk around on tiptoes worrying about his bad temper. He's totally the opposite. And that's how we need to think of him. That he is a God who is, what? Ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and he will not forsake. This passage comes from that time when God was ready to destroy the children of Israel after they had committed the sin of creating the golden calf. And Moses says, no, God, don't destroy them. And so God, and he was just testing Moses, relents. And then Moses says, all right, and I want something else from you, God. I want you to show me your glory. And so, God hid him and covered him so that he doesn't die and showed him his glory. And then God ended with this revelation. Moses, I want you and the people to know that this is the kind of God I am, that I am one who's ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and I will not forsake you. And that is basically the history that they went through to prepare all their people to sign on the dotted line when it came that time. I was going to give you 3 Bible verses that talks about God's faithfulness. Let me just give them to you real quickly. James 2:13 says, mercy triumphs over justice. Right? So mercy is priority. 2 Timothy 2:13 says, if we are faithless, he is faithful. He remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. And then the last verse is Romans 3:3, specifically the end of it. Romans 3:3 says that, you know what? If some are unfaithful, that doesn't nullify what? God's faithfulness. And so we should be willing and courageous to make commitments to continue to move forward in our spiritual lives and not to back away afraid that somewhere along the line we're going to mess up. So, some, you've hesitated to put your trust in God, to be saved, to say, God, I want you to have control of my life. That's a big commitment, but you need not be afraid. Some of you, we sang the song today about baptism. That was one of the songs that Michael wrote. That is another commitment. And unlike my pastor who would not baptize, we will baptize if you are ready. And so you need not be afraid that after that you may not do as well as you would like. Some of you, you're afraid to serve. You've been asked to serve in some way. And you say, you know what? I just don't know. I can be faithful and do this service day in, day out. Don't worry. God is faithful. And the one who is strong will be strong on your behalf. And that our short-term missions team, our care team has just come in. And you know what? Years ago, Pat and I, we made our commitment to God. You want us to be missionaries? We'll be missionaries. When we left for seminary, I thought God was going to call us to be a missionary teacher somewhere overseas. God may be calling you to dedicate your life in that sort of a way. And you might say, well, I'm not ready to go all that way. Well, guess what? In December 26th and 29th, we're going to have a great missions conference in Ontario, okay? And maybe you want to begin by making that level of a commitment. So think about it in your life. What do you need to do next? What's going to move you along? what's going to bring you into the adventure, into the great life that God wants you to experience. That's going to give you energy and to give you a vision and a future and really make your life more than eat, sleep, and watch TV, right? You make a commitment and you trust God because God is faithful even when we are what? Unfaithful. That's the kind of God we have. Okay? So that's my challenge to you, and I'm going to pray that God will move in each one of our hearts to see what's our next commitment.